Welcome back, true believers and all you merry Marvelites, to another very exciting episode of Avengers Project 101. So as we all know by now, is besides the major effect of the gameplay being described as an experience that players can engage themselves in for years to come, one of the major factors about Marvel's Avengers in general is going to be its ever-engaging story. And not only will this game directly feature an incredibly immersive experience related to its full-on single-player campaign, which you can play offline, but you can also continue the story with playing with your friends in 4-player co-op. And given that one of the major factors of the main developers who are currently working on the Avengers project with Crystal Dynamics mainly relates to their high-quality craft of creating extremely impactful narratives, I definitely think that the Avengers project will be no substitute. Well, luckily, there has been some news recently relating to the main creative director from Crystal Dynamics of Sean Eskai, as well as him describing what the overall narrative will primarily entail within Marvel's Avengers. But of course, one of the biggest aspects as to creating a main narrative based off of Marvel superheroes is obviously looking at the source material that they are based off of. And obviously with characters as big as the Avengers, there's definitely no exception as to the great amount of comic books that the creators are taking from for inspiration for this game's story. And just like how Spider-Man PS4 introduced fans to a brand new universe with lots of twists and turns relating to the characters that we all know and love, the same thing is essentially going to be done within Marvel's Avengers. However, given the particular comic books that they are using in the instance of the Avengers project, I definitely think the story may possibly be one of the biggest highlights of the game overall. So to break it all down for you guys, Sean was recently featured in an IGN interview discussing which particular comics him and the team over at Crystal Dynamics and Marvel Games looked at when forming the main narrative of the Avengers project. So not only did Sean provide some awesome books that I definitely recommend that you do read before playing Marvel's Avengers once it does release on May 15th, 2020, but I will also recommend some personal books that I think all you should read before playing the game as well. So to start with the interview itself, it does state Marvel's Avengers, the comics that inspire the upcoming Square Enix game. How will these two classic titles influence the Square Enix game? And to start off with the article itself, it does state we've had our first look at Square Enix's eagerly anticipated Marvel's Avengers game over the past few days. One thing that's quickly become apparent is that the game is pulling from all corners of the Avengers franchise, from the movies to the comics. And according to the game's lead creative director and writer Sean Eskai, Marvel's Avengers will draw from two Marvel books in particular, Marvel's and West Coast Avengers. So for me personally, Marvel's is one of my most favorite titles of all time, so seeing that they are actually going to incorporate aspects of it within the Avengers project narrative just makes me happy beyond belief. And given some of the plot points that this book does go into, I can definitely see why they would use such a title for the main narrative of the Avengers project. So to discuss it a bit more in depth, Marvel's is a 1994 miniseries from writer Kurt Busiek and artist Alex Ross, widely considered to be one of the finest comics Marvel has ever published. The series takes a real-time approach to the history of the Marvel Universe, spanning 1939, the year Namor and Human Torch made their debuts, to 1974, the year Green Goblin murdered Gwen Stacy. Over the course of the series, readers see pivotal Marvel Universe events unfold from the perspective of an everyman photojournalist named Phil Sheldon. Sheldon builds his reputation chronicling the triumphs and tragedies of heroes like Spider-Man, the Avengers, and the X-Men, before finally being disillusioned at the end of his career when Spider-Man fails to save Gwen Stacy. Marvel stands out as the rare comic that explores how the ordinary citizens of the Marvel Universe react to the massive battles and disasters that are an everyday fact of life to the Avengers and X-Men. Sheldon is given a ground floor view of pivotal Marvel events like Galactus' first attack and the surge of anti-mutant hysteria in the 1960s. His disillusionment at the end of the story reflects the transition Marvel Comics went through in the mid-70s as the Silver Age ended and a darker, more adult-oriented storytelling approach began to take hold. So the main aspect that I'm getting from this book in particular being implemented within the Marvel's Avengers story is that the overall tone will hopefully be a very serious one. And based off of everything that we saw within the A-Day trailer, specifically what happens after the events of A-Day, I can definitely see the story's tone taking a bit more of a darker turn after the 5-year time gap of the tragedy when it does take place. So moving on to the second comic that they are taking heavy inspiration from, which also could possibly relate to which roster of characters that we could be getting within this game in the future, is obviously the main influence of the West Coast Avengers. So not only were the West Coast Avengers referenced within Spider-Man PS4 when you did take a picture of Avengers Tower, but it is actually its own standalone comic series. And unlike Marvel's, it's definitely not as dark as that particular story was, but it does dive deep into the larger world that the Marvel Universe can entail. So as the article describes, where Marvel's tells a single self-contained story, West Coast Avengers had a long run at Marvel Comics during the 80s and 90s. It served as the first major attempt by Marvel to create a lasting companion series to the core Avengers book, paving the way for contemporary comics like New Avengers. As the name suggests, West Coast Avengers involves the team establishing a second headquarters in California, recognizing that not every threat in the Marvel Universe centers around New York. While the team roster shifted over the years, West Coast Avengers was notable for establishing a more eclectic team dynamic that focused less on the usual A-listers. The original West Coast Avengers roster consisted of Hawkeye, Mockingbird, Wonder Man, Tigra, and Iron Man, with James Rhodes wearing the armor rather than Tony Stark. The team roster continued to balance familiar Avengers characters with unusual choices like Moon Knight, Machine Man, and US Agent. So while the main book of Marvels is essentially focusing on what the main tone of the game is going to feature, I definitely think the West Coast Avengers tease is implying what characters we could see pop up in the coming years. But as the article goes on, Sean describes himself as to why these two books are so important into crafting such an impactful Avengers story. And as the article states, S-Guy made it pretty clear how Marvels will influence the game's story campaign. Marvel's Avengers will focus a great deal on the relationship between the team and the people they seek to protect, showing that even Earth's mightiest heroes can fail to live up to the expectations of those around them. There's some themes that I really like about the Avengers, S-Guy said. Are we superheroes? Are we dangerous? Are we who we are supposed to be, or are we a danger to society? In other words, can we embrace ourselves? And to go into more depth, S-Guy specifically pointed to Hulk as an example of how the conflict might play out in the game. I'm a scientist, but I have this part of me that just feels really good. But he's dangerous and he wrecks house and he destroys stuff. Is this really how superheroes are? Or am I just a giant green thing destroying and wrecking? So, those conflicts are some of the things that, for me, inspired the story and the driving forces of the Avengers. And questions how people that are just human, who don't have superpower abilities, how do they view the Avengers? What do they think about the Avengers? So, that's part of the core story. So given how immersed Sean sounds when talking about Marvel Comics and the overall world that they are creating within Marvel's Avengers, it definitely sounds like the story is going to be a really epic one to say the least. And seeing how Sean only used these two comics in particular, it makes me even more curious to see which other stories that they could possibly be pulling from. So alongside these two great series of Marvel's and West Coast Avengers, I myself have personally chosen two other comics that I definitely think you guys should check into if you are excited for Marvel's Avengers. So first off is a title that relates to the specific situation of the game's main premise, where all the Marvel heroes within the Avengers project do in fact have to reassemble after the events of A-Day. And knowing that they seemingly do in fact end up disbanding after that specific event, this comic in particular is definitely a great resource material for that specific tragedy. And mainly I'm talking about the title of Avengers Disassembled, written by none other than Brian Michael Bendis. So for those of you unaware, Avengers Disassembled begins with the return of a team member thought dead, and by the time it's over, everything you know about the Avengers changes. It was the worst day in the team's history, as Earth's mightiest heroes tried to deal with the shocking tragedy that surrounded them. And not only did it feature a wide roster of the main Avengers lineup, but it also featured one of their greatest enemies ever. And even though I won't spoil it for those of you who have not read it yet, I do think one of the main aspects that will be taken from this book within the Avengers project is the fact that they all are going to reassemble during one point of the game's narrative. And knowing that there is a 5-year time gap between the events of A-Day up to the current point of the Avengers project timeline, I'm very curious myself as to what the Avengers have been doing after the events of that day. So hopefully we do end up receiving a lot of standout character moments within each time we do play as a different Avenger during the main story. And as for my last comic recommendation after the two that Sean gave, and Avengers Disassembled, is none other than the ultimate version of the Avengers themselves. So just like how I mentioned Spider-Man PS4 earlier, is that one of the main universes that Insomniac and Marvel looked at when forming that game's universe is none other than Ultimate Spider-Man. However, it wasn't in the sense where they directly copy and pasted from the Ultimate Comics universe, but instead they ended up creating their own unique universe which was different from the standard norm. So while each character within the Ultimate Universe does stay true to the core characteristics as to what makes them their own respective heroes, I do think it would be very interesting to look into how each character is differently portrayed from the standard version of the classic comics. This doesn't just relate to how their origins in particular are different from the standard versions, but it also showcases how they can do things in a new and different way that people could possibly end up enjoying. So with Marvel's Avengers said to be a world that players can immerse themselves in for years to come, I myself am very excited to learn every piece of info about this particular universe of the Marvel lore. And even though we may not know just yet what the full story is going to entail, I can't wait to see what's in store for the future. And with all that said, everyone, that's the video I have for you today, and please let me know all your thoughts in the comments section down below. What do you think of the two Marvel comics that Sean is referencing to help craft the Marvel's Avengers story, and which comics are you personally going to read before playing the game? For me personally, I am still beyond thrilled that they are actually using Marvels to help craft the Avengers project story, and whatever they do end up using from it, I really hope it just blows all my expectations out of the water. And with all that said, everyone, thank you all so much for watching, stay merry Marvelites, and peace out.
We were outsmarted.
The Terrigen reactor was unstable, and you knew that, and you still paraded it before the entire world.
So what? We just give up?
We didn't give up, Tony. We failed. At least I can admit that.
No, we failed him. We failed him.